In this video, I want to talk about one particular aspect that occurred in the US during the lead up to the Civil War. And of course, there were lots of aspects that occurred, but I want today to focus on Kansas and the idea of what became known in history as Bleeding Kansas. And Kansas has a lengthy history. As I mentioned in one of the early videos in this course, historians actually disagree on how long Native Americans have lived in the Americas. Some historians say it may have been for only the past 12 to 13,000 years. Other historians say it may have been for 30,000 years. My guess is that the answer is somewhere in the middle, but it's only a guess. I'm not an anthropologist or an archaeologist, and that is not my field. So sources I've seen sort of for Kansas approximate, again, the past, maybe 20,000 years. Animals live there far longer, and the Kansas climate cycled through things far more spectacular than even the cycles we see in historical times. And Kansas, because of its location in the middle of the continent, is much older geologically than, say, Massachusetts or Florida or other coastal states. And because of that, geologically speaking, we can say that the state has an unbroken past. Geographically, Kansas is sort of like a wedge of cheese on its side. We think of Kansas as being flat, and it is, but it does have some elevation. The highest point in Kansas is 4,000 feet above sea level. It's Mount Sunflower in the western part of the state. Eastern Kansas is 3,400 feet lower than that. It's about 600 feet above sea level. There's a big precipitation range as well. Southeast Kansas gets lots of precipitation, relatively speaking, up to 60 inches a year on average. Western Kansas gets very little precipitation, no more than 15 inches on average, but 18 inches is what's needed to grow crops. The dividing line between western and eastern Kansas is roughly a line that starts in Wichita, and if you know where Salina is, which most people probably don't, Salina is kind of due north of Wichita, and that line is the dividing line. Kansas sees very dramatic weather. You may know about Tornado Alley and things like that. That's because of what's called continentality. Places that are far away from the moderating influences of large bodies of water tend to see more dramatic weather. That's why the Dakotas, for example, see really hot weather in the summer and really cold weather in the winter, far away from moderating influences. Kansas has more extreme weather in terms of storms because it's closer to the Gulf of Mexico. And so when warm, moist air comes north from the Gulf of Mexico and collides with cold air that's rushing down from Canada, that's what causes severe storms in Kansas and other parts of the lower Midwest. So very dramatic weather. So Liebig's law says that there are some things needed for survival in fragile ecosystems. That people have to have strategies that will allow them to survive in the worst conditions likely to appear. On the Great Plains, that would be places like Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, the Western Dakotas. The worst conditions, probably the middle of deep winter in the middle of a drought. People over time miscalculated about this. That was true for Native Americans as well as for later Europeans. For example, Native American tribes in the plains, especially the southern plains, became over-dependent on the horse. So, jumping forward to closer to our time period. In the mid-19th century, with Manifest Destiny strong, the U.S. plopped down a political unit on this part of the country. And they decided they were going to deal with the issue of slavery there like they were dealing with the issues involving Native American peoples, which was essentially in the U.S. mindset, go there, fight it out, we'll muddle through somehow. In 1850, there was a big amorphous means not having clear boundaries, territory in the region that was called alternately Indian Territory or Indian Country. And this included most or maybe all of the present states of Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Colorado. This time period also saw the second major Indian removal in U.S. history. The first one was from the southeast to what's now Oklahoma. We talked about that, the Trail of Tears. The second one was tribes who lived in Kansas and Nebraska and moving them from there to Oklahoma. These moves greatly annoyed the Cherokee, who had been promised Oklahoma. After the Mexican War, Kansas-Nebraska was no longer a border region. Previously, the Kansas-Nebraska area was a border between the U.S. and Mexico. That Indians in that region served as a buffer state, essentially, between the U.S. and Mexico. But now, there's no need for a buffer state. This is the era of the railroad. It took 90 days, 3 months to travel from Boston to San Francisco by ship. There were essentially two ways to do it. You could go all the way around the tip of South America, which was the longest. And the tip of South America, as you may know, has very dangerous weather. Another possibility was to go to Central America and then cross by land. Remember, this was before the Panama Canal was built. And the third way was the so-called Oregon Trail, which some of you may have played in elementary school. The quickest way was by ship. That's still a 3-month trip. The railroad and the telegraph were really promising developments in U.S. history because it was believed they could tie the country together. There was a lot of worry in the 1850s that the West would secede. California is in the gold rush. They have lots of money. There were concerns in the East that states in the West would secede. There was as much concern that as there was that the southern states would secede. Transcontinental Railroad routes were proposed. There was a northern route that was seen as being too cold. There was a southern route that would go through the modern states of Arizona and New Mexico before they were states. That was seen as too dry through the desert. And so a middle route was eventually agreed upon. Stephen Douglas, you may know Stephen Douglas as Lincoln's opponent for senator and the namesake of Lincoln-Douglas debates. Some of you may have participated in those in high school or maybe even in college, depending on where you've gone to college. Stephen Douglas was the main proponent of what became known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which had essentially 3 steps. It would organize this territory, this amorphous Indian country. It would, by this time American tradition, remove Native Americans from the region. And it would do something about slavery. Remember the Missouri Compromise. States north of 36 degrees, 30 minutes north would be free. States south of that would enter as slave states. In 1850, there was a crisis because California, part of which was below that line, was admitted to the Union as a free state. There was also the new creation of Utah Territory, which essentially comprised the modern states of Utah and Nevada. And Utah Territory would also be free. It was north of that line, or at least most of it was, not all of it. This led to a new idea, popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty argued there should be no set line for slavery or freedom. Rather, the voters of a state or territory should decide political issues themselves rather than the Congress. And most supporters of popular sovereignty thought this meant that Nebraska would enter the Union eventually as a free state, and Kansas would enter the Union eventually as a slave state. And Stephen Douglas was the main supporter of this idea of popular sovereignty. Most people thought this doctrine was more advantageous to the South. Remember, there were relatively little territory in the U.S. by this point, and potential territory that was going to enter anymore as slave states. But you have lots now of Western territory. You have the Oregon country. You have the northern parts of the Louisiana Purchase, the areas that would eventually become the Dakotas, Montana, Wyoming. So the South, under the Missouri Compromise, has very little new territory that could enter as slave states potentially. And of that territory, one biggest section of it, California, had already entered as a free state. That essentially only left Arizona and New Mexico, neither of which were particularly well suited for cotton production, at least at that time. I think irrigation may have changed things in Arizona since then. But in the 1800s at least, Arizona, not a good place to grow cotton. So this idea that, oh, people should be allowed to choose was thought to be more advantageous to the South because people, it was believed, in territories that cotton would make sense to grow in, would want to have a slave-based economy there. This new idea of popular sovereignty, which essentially got the approval of Congress, led to lots of people coming in droves to the new Kansas Territory. People that wanted it to be a free state, and people that wanted it to be a slave state. And the name Bleeding Kansas was essentially begun by Horace Greeley in the New York Tribune. The first era of Kansas history is called by historians Inter arma leges silent, which is Latin, and it means among arms, laws are silent. And arms here means, right, arms, like the right to bear arms. So it means weapons. In other words, when everyone has tons of weapons, the laws don't matter. And that is what was true for Kansas in its early territorial history. There were more anti-slavery than pro-slavery forces in Kansas Territory. The pro-slavery forces founded communities that today are cities in Kansas, communities of Atchison and Leavenworth. And in early elections, pro-slavery forces won. Why did they win? Well, one reason they won was because of border ruffians. These were Missourians who crossed the border illegally. They can cross the border, but then they illegally stuffed the ballot box. They weren't Kansas residents. They were not territorial residents. They literally crossed the border to vote. In some places in Kansas during these elections, there were twice as many votes as voters. Now, few border ruffians owned slaves. They were too poor. But they were deeply racist. And they also hated so-called Yankees. Now, admittedly, even without the border ruffians stuffing ballot boxes, probably the election results would still have been pro-slavery, even without the fraud. The territorial legislature met and they expelled the delegates, in other words, representatives, who were anti-slavery. And they wrote pro-slavery laws. Now, I mentioned that the border ruffians hated so-called Yankees. Who are the Yankees here? Well, Yankees are traditionally New Englanders. And New England was a hotbed of anti-slavery and abolitionist activity. And the New England Emigrant Aid Company helped create anti-slavery settlements in Topeka, which is, of course, Kansas's current capital, and Lawrence, which is the home of the University of Kansas. And so at this point, there was a rival government set up in Topeka, which wrote another state constitution. This is essentially treason. Now, we today like anti-slavery groups, we like abolitionists, but this particular action that they did was in fact technically, not technically, legally, treason. It was circumventing the federal procedures that were in place for a territorial government. One of the most famous New Englanders of this period who was an abolitionist was Henry Ward Beecher. He collected funds for immigrants to Kansas, and then these immigrants were armed with what became known as Beecher's Bibles, which were a type of rifle. Beecher is the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. They were called Beecher's Bibles, by the way, because they were shipped to Kansas in crates labeled essentially books and Bibles. So the Free Soil legislature, free soil means a state that doesn't want slavery. And so the Free Soil legislature is meeting in Topeka. They weren't necessarily abolitionists. It wasn't necessarily that they opposed slavery. And it certainly didn't mean that they weren't racist. What it did mean was they didn't want plantation-style agriculture in Kansas. They didn't want giant plantations growing single crops. Charles Robinson was the Free State governor in Topeka at this time. He was put on federal trial for impersonating a governor as opposed to treason, which he could have been tried for. So it was a lesser charge. In a constitutional convention in Kansas, the Free State or Free Soil group didn't vote, and the convention didn't put the entire constitution that was done at another capital in Lecompton, Kansas, to a vote, submitted only the clause about slavery. Is Kansas going to be slave or free? The Free Soilers boycotted the election, and as always happens when a group boycotts an election, the other group wins. The Constitution with slavery wins overwhelmingly. In 1857, there was another congressional election in Kansas for the territorial legislature. The Free Soilers or Free Staters participated now. They win overwhelmingly. And now they're in charge of a legislature, this pro-slavery legislature, that they didn't actually recognize. And so, but they repealed everything because they were in control now of everything the legislature had passed as much as they could, including the previously passed Lecompton Constitution. There was a vote in 1858, this time pro-slavery forces boycotted, and of course, as always happens when you boycott a vote, the other side wins, and the Constitution was rejected. And now the Topeka Constitution is sent to Congress to act, and there's a 3-month debate on what the will of Kansans actually was. So when a territory becomes a state, they propose a constitution, and that has to be approved by Congress as part of the process by when a territory becomes a state. There was essentially a compromise called the English Compromise. Kansas would vote on the Lecompton Constitution. If approved, Kansas would be admitted immediately to the Union and would even get federal land grants. It was a big deal. If it was rejected, Kansas would have to wait until its population reached a certain level, which it was supposed to. Like, there are rules about how populated a territory should be before it can become a state. They were going to waive this for Kansas, but Kansas rejected the Lecompton Constitution. And this became known as an irrepressible conflict. Slavery had to be eliminated. There was no other way to do it than violently. Peaceful processes were believed that they simply would not work. By 1858, both the North and the South were talking about seceding. And this early struggle formed the early character of Kansas. It tended to be a very dangerous place. For example, in 1856, Lawrence was raided by border ruffians who invaded and burned parts of the city, and one border ruffian was actually killed. In retaliation, there was the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre, which was led by John Brown, a person you may have heard of. If you haven't, look him up. He's an interesting figure. And he's a controversial figure. For a long time in history, as we'll see on the next slide, people disliked him, or historians did. But he probably deserves a better reputation than he once had. Despite this, 5 men were executed with a scythe. He mutilated the raiders anyway, mutilated their bodies. This removed the last sort of restraint to a full civil war in Kansas, and Brown felt completely justified in this. So when I say civil war in Kansas, I don't mean the American Civil War. I mean a local civil war with person against person, pro-slavery versus anti-slavery. So as I mentioned, John Brown remains controversial, and the most negative pictures about him tend to be painted by Southern historians, particularly Southern historians who sympathize with slavery. Now, today, that's not many Southern historians, but it was a lot of Southern historians for a very long time. In some of the optional resources that I've put together for the week, you will see information about the so-called lost cause, and that ties into this. Brown was really an interesting person. Even considering his time period of the 19th century, he was truly not race conscious. In other words, he truly was a person who, as Dr. King said, would judge a person not by the color of his skin, but by the content of his character. That was John Brown. Now, he was definitely monomaniacal. What does that mean? It means he was interested in one issue and one issue only, and he was totally interested in that issue. And that issue was slavery, was the abolition of slavery. He was not necessarily insane, even though historians have tried to persuade people that he was for a long time. The Wakarusa War, also called the Border War, occurs in 1855 and 56 in Kansas. Again, this is essentially a local civil war. From 75 to 150 people were killed, so it's maybe not a war over that course of 2 years or so, but there's lots of stuff going on. Wilson Shannon was the Kansas governor, territorial governor, who ended that war with the treaty at Fort Scott. People feared that this was the start of a national civil war. And then Quantrill's raid occurs during the Civil War. In 1863, 150 Kansans were killed in Lawrence by pro-slavery militia. And this is actually the most famous incident of the Civil War in Kansas. So I share Kansas here because the controversies in Kansas really symbolize and they are emblematize the national confrontation about slavery that is growing increasingly important in the 1850s. Kansas was in some ways a microcosm of what would happen in the U.S. in a few years in the Civil War. Thanks for watching.